Millions of people deal with this every single night, and almost none of them talk about it. Not to their friends, not to their family, sometimes not even to their doctor, because the shame around it is so heavy that staying silent feels easier than admitting it exists. But here's what's important to understand right from the start. This is not a childhood problem that some people just failed to grow out of. This is not a sign of laziness or weakness or poor hygiene, and it is definitely not something a person chooses. Bedwetting is real. It affects more adults than you would ever guess, and the psychology behind it is far deeper and far more human than most people realize. So if this is something you or someone you care about lives with quietly, keep watching, because what comes next might finally make sense of something that never did before. Let's start with the basics, without the clinical coldness. Bedwetting, or what doctors call nocturnal enuresis, simply means losing bladder control during sleep. The body releases urine at night without the person waking up or being aware of it in time. Now here's something most people don't know. It is far more common than the numbers we usually hear. Studies suggest that around 1 to 2% of adults experience this regularly. That might sound small, but when you do the math across a global population, that's tens of millions of people quietly dealing with something they believe makes them uniquely broken. They are not broken. The bladder and the brain communicate through a specific signal system during sleep. In some people, for various reasons, that communication doesn't work as reliably as it should at night. That's the physical side. But there's another side almost nobody talks about, and that's where things get genuinely interesting. Most conversations about bedwetting stop at the medical explanation. Weak bladder, deep sleep, hormonal imbalance. These are all real and valid factors, but they tell only part of the story. Here's what the research actually shows. Psychology plays a significant role in bedwetting, not as the only cause, but as a contributing factor that is consistently underestimated and almost never addressed. Think about it this way. Your body and your mind are not separate systems running parallel to each other. They are one connected system, constantly influencing each other. What happens in your emotional world shows up in your physical body, and what happens in your body shows up in your emotional state. Stress does this, anxiety does this, trauma does this. And here's what almost no one realizes. These psychological factors don't just affect you when you're awake. They follow you into sleep. They change how deeply you sleep, how your nervous system behaves during the night, and how well your brain and bladder communicate while you're unconscious. So when someone experiences bedwetting that has a psychological component, it isn't a character flaw. It is literally their nervous system carrying something it hasn't been able to put down yet. That changes everything about how we should look at this. Let's go a little deeper into what stress actually does to the body at night. When a person is under consistent stress or lives with ongoing anxiety, their nervous system stays in a kind of low-level alert state. Think of it like a phone that never fully powers down. Even in sleep mode, it's still running processes in the background, still consuming energy, still reacting to inputs. This state is called hyperarousal, which simply means the nervous system is more activated than it should be at rest. And here's where it connects directly to bedwetting. When the nervous system is in this state, two things happen that are relevant. First, sleep architecture changes. The person may cycle through sleep stages differently, spending less time in the lighter stages where the brain is more capable of receiving and responding to signals from the body. Second, the bladder itself becomes more sensitive. Stress hormones influence muscle tension and organ behavior throughout the body, including the muscles that control bladder function. So, a person who is chronically stressed is essentially sleeping with a body that is both less aware and more reactive at the same time. Less aware because the brain isn't catching the signal properly. more reactive because the bladder is behaving erratically under the influence of stress hormones. Almost no one connects these two things. They assume the bedwetting is purely physical. They treat the symptom, but the stress underneath continues, and so does the bedwetting. There's also something worth mentioning about children specifically. When a child goes through a stressful period, starting a new school, a family conflict, moving to a new home, it is extremely common for bedwetting to begin or return even after it had stopped. This is the body's direct response to emotional stress. It is not regression. It is not bad behavior. It is a stress signal expressed through the body. The same mechanism operates in adults, just with less acknowledgement and far more shame attached to it. Now, here's a part of this conversation that rarely gets the space it deserves. For many people who struggle with bedwetting, especially those who dealt with it through childhood and into adolescence, the emotional environment around it shaped them just as much as the condition itself. Consider what it feels like for a child to wake up and immediately know what has happened. Before they've even fully opened their eyes, the anxiety is already there. And then comes the next fear. Who will find out? What will be said? What will happen? In households where bedwetting was met with frustration, punishment, or public humiliation, even if that humiliation was unintentional, a very specific psychological pattern develops. The child begins to associate sleep itself with anxiety. They may resist going to bed. They may sleep with constant low-level tension. They may wake frequently through the night, checking. And here's the painful irony. That anxiety and tension make the bedwetting more likely, not less. The emotional response designed to prevent the problem actually feeds it. A child who is punished for bedwetting doesn't gain bladder control from the punishment, they gain fear. And fear, as we've already established, lives in the nervous system, and the nervous system is exactly what controls this. Beyond the household, there's the broader emotional identity that forms. A child who has struggled with bedwetting for years often builds a quiet but consistent internal story about themselves, that they are somehow behind, somehow less capable, somehow different in a way they can't fix no matter how hard they try. That story doesn't disappear when the bedwetting eventually stops. It stays, and it shapes how that person sees themselves long into adulthood. The shame cycle. This is the part that keeps everything locked in place. The shame cycle. It works like this. Bedwetting happens. The person feels embarrassment, sometimes intense embarrassment. That embarrassment creates anxiety around sleep. Going to bed becomes a stressful event rather than a restful one. The nervous system stays activated, and that activation makes the bedwetting more likely to happen again, which creates more shame, which creates more anxiety, which creates more bedwetting. It feeds itself. And the most frustrating part of this cycle is that the harder a person tries to control it through willpower or self-criticism, the more they are actually intensifying the anxiety component that makes it worse. You cannot willpower your way out of a stress response. Pressure doesn't relax a nervous system, it tightens it. Here's something important to understand about shame specifically. Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Guilt can motivate change. Shame almost never does. Shame isolates. It makes people hide. It prevents them from seeking help. It convinces them that they are uniquely broken in a way that no help could fix. And for something like bedwetting, where the shame is already so heavy that most people won't even say the word out loud, that shame becomes one of the biggest barriers to ever getting better. Breaking the cycle doesn't start with the bladder. It starts with dismantling the shame. How it affects self-esteem. The effects of this don't stay contained to nighttime. They spread. People who deal with bedwetting, especially those who have carried it in silence for a long time, often show specific patterns in how they move through their social world. Sleepovers become impossible to navigate. School trips with overnight stays become sources of dread rather than excitement. Relationships become complicated because intimacy means vulnerability, and vulnerability means the possibility of someone finding out. So people pull back. They create distance. They decline invitations with excuses that feel easier than the truth. Over time, this social withdrawal starts to look like introversion or anxiety to the outside world. And in a way, it is anxiety, but the root of it is something much more specific and much more hidden. There's also the internal confidence piece. When a person has spent years feeling unable to control something as basic as their own body during sleep, it creates a quiet but persistent doubt about their own capability. It whispers in the background of unrelated situations, job interviews, new relationships, unfamiliar environments. A general sense of being someone who loses control, someone who fails at simple things. None of that is true, but it feels true. And feelings, when they're old enough and quiet enough, start to feel like facts. This is why bedwetting is never just about the bedwetting. How to break the cycle. So what actually helps? The first and most important shift is removing blame from the conversation entirely. Whether you're a parent dealing with this in a child, a partner, a friend, or someone navigating this yourself, blame has no useful function here. It doesn't produce better outcomes. It only adds shame to an already heavy load. Replacing blame with calm, neutral acknowledgement changes the entire emotional environment around the issue. The second piece is addressing the stress and anxiety that are likely contributing underneath. This doesn't always require formal therapy, though therapy is genuinely useful for many people dealing with this. It can start with something simpler, looking honestly at what the person's daily stress load looks like, what their sleep environment feels like, whether they have space to wind down before bed in a way that actually relaxes their nervous system rather than just filling time. For children especially, feeling emotionally safe at home is not a secondary concern. It is a primary one. A child whose emotional environment is calm, consistent, and non-judgmental around this issue will almost always show improvement faster than a child whose environment adds pressure to the problem. For adults, seeking medical evaluation is a reasonable and important step, not because the solution is purely medical, but because ruling out physical factors and having a knowledgeable professional involved removes some of the isolation. And finally, if the shame and psychological weight have been building for a long time, talking to a mental health professional is not an overreaction. It is appropriate. Because what has built up around this issue over years often needs more than practical strategies. It needs to be heard, understood, and properly processed. The cycle can be broken, but it requires compassion as the starting point, not pressure. Here's what we want to leave you with. This is not weakness. This is not immaturity. This is not something a person deserves to feel ashamed of or defined by. It is something the brain and body are dealing with, often carrying the weight of stress, emotion, and experience that has never had a proper place to go. The people who live with this quietly, who have spent years managing the logistics and the silence and the shame, are not broken. They are carrying something heavy without enough support, and they deserve understanding, not judgment. If this video described something you recognize in yourself, please don't let the shame convince you that silence is the only option. It isn't. And if it described someone you love, the most powerful thing you can offer them is not a solution. It's safety. It's the kind of environment where the truth can finally be spoken without fear. Because that, more than anything else, is where healing begins.